The craziest prison escapes from around the world. The year is 2030, and you and the love of your life are looking out of the window of a luxury helicopter at the beautiful landscape of southern France. Doesn't that just sound like the best vacation ever and a dream come true? Now imagine this. Swap luxury helicopter for old hijacked helicopter, swap the love of your life for one of your co-conspirators, and swap helicopter tour with prison escape. And while you're still in the south of France, you're in a much different situation. And this situation is one of the craziest French prison escapes ever. Our story begins on July 7th, 1963, when our protagonist Pascal Payet was born. And while Pascal had a relatively normal childhood in the south of France, it wasn't long before he started his criminal career and lived a life that was anything but normal. In 1988, at the ripe age of 25, Pascal was convicted of his first crime, aggravated assault. And only 5 years later, in 1993, he was once again convicted of conspiracy. But it wasn't until 4 years after that, on November 20th, 1997, when Pascal's story truly began. Pascal and a group of other French criminals planned and executed an attack on an armored vehicle for the Bank of France. The robbery of this armored vehicle was anything but smooth, and during the robbery, one of the guards of this vehicle was killed, turning a robbery case into a murder case and beyond. Pascal and his associates were able to leave the scene of the crime successfully that day, but they weren't free for long, because in 1999, Pascal, along with his associate Eric Alborio, were found and arrested in Paris. I want to emphasize, all of this is horrible, and he definitely deserves to be in jail, but it's crazy that already this guy is literally living like it's GTA France. But if you think the actions that got Pascal into jail were GTA-esque, just wait until I tell you how he got out of jail. It is January 1999, and Pascal has just arrived in Loigna. He sees a structure begin to appear outside of the prison bus window. This is a maximum security French prison, and it has existed for over 2 centuries, seeing over the years the craziest list of almost any criminal you could imagine. The history of this place alone is insane, and with centuries to refine their techniques, they were no amateurs when it came to holding and punishing criminals. This prison was built and rebuilt numerous times throughout the last 2 centuries, and its most recent iteration was regarded as one of the most technologically advanced prisons in all of France, and it was considered escape-proof. And if you watched our first video about prison escapes, then you know that escape-proof prisons are not a title, they're a challenge. And to Pascal, that challenge seemed enticing. As Pascal has walked into his cell and sat on his bed, the guards uncuff his ankles and wrists, slam the door behind them, and Pascal is now officially in his new, all-expenses-paid home in the south of France. And the timer has officially begun. To the French government, the timer is counting down the amount of days that Pascal has left to serve. However, in Pascal's brain, a different timer has begun. The timer to plan an escape. And while Pascal had 30 years to sit and think about his plan, it only took him 2 years to theorize and execute his grand escape. Or escapes, I should say. But quickly, a word from today's sponsor. Have you ever caught yourself reaching out for a bad habit without even thinking about it? Maybe it's out of boredom or stress. Well, Fume, the sponsor of today's video, offers a simple and enjoyable way to break away from bad habits while still having something satisfying to reach for. Fume is an award-winning flavored air device that delivers great taste without any harmful chemicals, satisfying your craving without providing the downsides of the other stuff. Fume is the perfect gadget for an oral fixation or a fidgeting habit. So whether you're looking to keep your hands busy or satisfy your urge to grab something, Fume's premium wooden design is built both for flavor and function. Fume is designed with a high-quality build and a sleek aesthetic, and even just feels premium in your hand. So if you've been looking to ditch a bad habit, consider giving Fume a try. Over 500,000 people have already made the switch to Fume, making it part of their habit-changing journey. And if you want to give it a try yourself, check out my link in the description, and for a limited time, if you order the Journey Pack using my code TrustMeBro, you'll get a free Fume topper. Go to tryfume.com/TrustMeBro or scan the QR code on screen to get your Fume today. It is October 12th, 2001. And it has been 2 years since Pascal has been behind bars. And over this time, he has been coordinating strategically with one man on the outside, a man named Frédéric Mboko. And together, they put together a plan to quickly and easily take Pascal out of this prison. And today was the day they executed the plan. The plan began with Mboko hijacking a helicopter and flying it over top of the prison. The helicopter then quickly landed in a designated part of the courtyard where Pascal would enter the helicopter and the two would fly away into freedom. Although the plan didn't go that smoothly, because although they both got away successfully out of the jail, only 6 days later, Impolco was detained and taken in for questioning. But while Impolco was now behind bars, Pascal was a free man once again. But unfortunately, he still needed to make a living now that he was on the outside. And he dove right back into the only career he knew, stealing. And for 2 years, while on the run, Pascal would rob small-time jewelry stores and live off the profits from his heists. But after those 2 years, he must have began to get lonely, or maybe he felt bad for leaving his associates behind. Because on April 14th, 2003, Pascal decided that being free alone wasn't good enough, and he wanted to free some of his friends as well. And that is exactly what he did. Pascal once again organized a helicopter escape from the exact same prison that he escaped from 2 years earlier. This time, he was already free, and he was now freeing 3 other men. The same men that were involved in the bank truck heist in 1997. And once again, a helicopter was hijacked, flown over top of the prison, quickly landing to pick up the criminals, and then flying off into the sunset. But once again, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, because this time, it wasn't just one of the men that were caught. 3 weeks after this second helicopter prison escape, all of the men were caught. There's absolutely no question that Pascal is a bad man, but he's definitely a good friend to his fellow criminals, proving that maybe there is honor among thieves after all. Interestingly, while imprisoned once again, Pascal decided to take another approach, and instead of planning another escape, he decided to write a blog post. A blog post specifically about the mistreatment he was experiencing in the French prison system. He complained that the conditions he was experiencing was poor, and he was also complaining of being transferred so many times, specifically being transferred 9 times in 30 months. And in combination with this letter, he also went on a hunger strike in one of these prisons because he didn't want to be moved again. These attempts were unsuccessful, but they, happened. At this point, Pascal is behind bars for good, right? He was able to coordinate 2 separate helicopter escapes, and at this point, he is now serving so much time behind bars. Like seriously, after all of the dust had settled, Pascal was facing 30 years for the murder that happened on the truck in 1997, 6 years for the jailbreak that happened in 2001, 7 years for busting his friends out in 2003, and now he's resorted to writing blog posts and not eating. So now he's not only mentally given up, but also physically frail. There's no way that he's, going to have any other escapes, right? And the answer is, of course not. By the time that July 2007 rolled around, Pascal was one of the most closely monitored prisoners in all of France. And for good reason. And what that looked like was consistent surveillance by guards and also being placed permanently in solitary confinement. In combination with both of those measures, Pascal was also moved every 6 months to new prisons so that he couldn't formulate a plan for too long, which also ironically increased his transfer frequency, something he was trying to get reduced with his hunger strike and letter. Regardless, even with all of these measures in place, Pascal still had a bit more fight in him. And on July 14th, 2007, on Bastille Day, a national holiday in France, Pascal made his final escape. If you're unfamiliar with Bastille Day, imagine the 4th of July, but in France. Fireworks, food, friends, family, just a lot of festive things. And while many see this as an opportunity to relax, Pascal saw this as an opportunity to get to work. And work he did. Because while all of the festivities were happening outside and law enforcement were already busy enough with all of the festivities happening, 4 men in ski masks were quickly approaching a French airport to once again hijack a helicopter. These men were successful. They kidnapped a pilot, hijacked the helicopter, and forced this pilot to fly over the prison that Pascal was currently in. The helicopter once again landed in the prison. The men went into the prison and freed Pascal from his solitary confinement, and in only 5 minutes after arriving, the helicopter was flying out of the jail. The criminals forced the pilot to fly 40 kilometers northeast to a location on the Mediterranean coast, where they had the pilot land the helicopter, and the pilot and the helicopter were free. And unfortunately, so was Pascal Paillet. 2 days after this escape took place, a Europe-wide arrest warrant was placed against Pascal Paillet, and even still, it took over 2 months for Pascal to be caught. However, on September 21st, 2007, in a suburb of Barcelona, Spain, Pascal was caught and once again put into French custody, where he remains to this very day. This story is almost picture perfect and kinda has everything you want. A beautiful European landscape, helicopters, crime, suspense, helicopters, friendship. It's really got it all, and I knew for that reason I had to make it the first entry on this list. Because seriously, how do you have 3 consecutive prison escapes, all involving hijacked helicopters. Like, if nothing else, you've got to admit that this guy is consistent. Pascal found his method and just worked it till he couldn't anymore. What I find crazy is now, after the 3rd successful helicopter escape, the police have decided that they're going to make the location of Pascal private for security reasons, obviously to avoid a 4th helicopter escape, which I think is logical and possibly a bit, late, but I guess still worth doing. But yeah, it's just crazy to think that there's a good chance that Pascal could have been a free man after his first successful helicopter escape. At the time, he was behind bars and facing 30 years for a murder that took place in 1997, but decided that even though he was free, he wanted to go back and help his 3 friends escape as well, which is something I really wish I knew the motivation behind, but I guess that is kind of up to speculation. He could have freed his friends because, he wanted his friends to have the same freedom as him, or maybe because he was, as a free man still living a life of crime, he wanted his crime friends back so he could, have more people to commit crime with. It's really up in the air on his motivation, but regardless, he did it. And now, as of today, his laundry list of charges goes as follows: 30 years for the murder, 6 years for jailbreak 1, 7 years for jailbreak 2, 5 years for jailbreak 3, and on top of all of these, an additional 15 years for all of the robberies that took place while he was a free man. At that point, he would have been better off just serving his initial 30 years. But I guess the moral of the story here is crime never pays. Now, what do you get when you mix 2 charming, intelligent, cold-blooded killers, a lonely and vulnerable prison employee, and paper-thin prison walls? Well, you'd be getting our next story. Richard Ricky Matt was born on June 25th, 1966, and grew up in foster care in Buffalo, New York. His childhood was anything but desirable. Throughout the course of his adult life, he had served multiple prison sentences that were shorter term. But once he was free again after serving his time, he decided that his best course of action was to get a job and then 2 weeks after working there, rob, kidnap, and murder his boss. And after this murder, he fled to Mexico, where he, a year later, robbed and killed another man. For this second murder, he received a 23-year sentence. But in 2007, Richard was extradited back to the United States, where he received a 25 to life sentence for his first murder, the murder of William Rickerson, the man who tried to give his convict a career and an opportunity, only to be robbed, kidnapped, and murdered and dismembered by the man he was only trying to help. Regardless, Richard was convicted of second-degree murder and was sent to the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York State. David Paul Sweat was born on June 14th, 1980, in Binghamton, New York State. He was raised by a single mother and grew up with 2 sisters, and from a child, he was a troubled individual. Even as young as 9, David was demonstrating extremely violent tendencies, and for that reason, his mom sent him to Florida to live with his uncle, which resulted in David stealing and wrecking his aunt's car, and his aunt and uncle then sending him into foster care. During his late teens, Sweat was essentially homeless, living off of any money he could make selling weed. It was during this time that he began planning elaborate burglaries. And throughout his late teens in the 1990s, Sweat was arrested and sent to prison multiple times, where he served his sentences. But on the 4th of July in 2002, Sweat, his cousin, and a 3rd accomplice decided that they would cash in on the profits of 4th of July and robbed a fireworks store in Pennsylvania. Not to steal fireworks, however, but to steal guns. These 3 men were successfully able to steal the firearms. And that night, after the robbery, drove from Pennsylvania back to New York State, where they planned on splitting up the loot. The 3 men pulled into a dimly lit parking lot where the others' cars were parked, and they began to divide up the loot. But while transferring guns from one of the cars to the other, a police officer spotted what was going on and decided to investigate. As the police officer began to approach the men, Sweat opened fire on the police officer, but didn't kill him. That was until Sweat decided to run over this police officer with his vehicle and then drive away. After Sweat was gone, Sweat's cousin decided to then shoot the police officer in the head again. The men all left the parking lot, but fortunately, only a few days later, all 3 men were caught. Sweat pled guilty to avoid the death sentence and was convicted of first-degree murder, and he was too sent to the Clinton Correctional Facility. I'm sure you're already seeing a bit of similarities and differences between these 2 horrible people. Richard and David both spent time in foster care, both had violent tendencies, and both had numerous run-ins in the law and spent time in prison before the time they ever even met, which leads us to when they did meet, which obviously took place within the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York State. And unfortunately, these 2 didn't only serve time together, but formed a rather twisted friendship, and shortly after bonding, began planning their escape from prison. At the beginning of this story, I did mention that these men were intelligent and charming, and unfortunately, that is the case for most psychopaths, something that obviously both of these men were. They had no empathy, no remorse, and no issue killing innocent people for their own gain. But another key component of psychopaths are their tendency to manipulate people, and that tendency to manipulate was a huge huge factor in the eventual escape of Richard and David. And that escape in question is kind of a blend of the very real Alcatraz escape that I actually talked about in the first prison escape video and the fictional Shawshank Redemption prison escape. Early on in their plans to escape, they both knew that if they wanted to escape, they were going to need some serious help. And because of this, the first step in their plan involved manipulating somebody on the inside to begin helping them. And that person on the inside was Joyce Mitchell. Mitchell was an older woman working as a supervisor in the Taylor department of the prison. And for reasons unknown to us, Richard and David decided that she was the perfect person to convert to their side. And how they went about doing this was extremely upsetting because they used not aggression or fear, but love. Both of these men individually began to develop intimate relationships with Joyce Mitchell within the prison. And over time, were able to get her to begin helping them by providing supplies, specifically by getting tools out of the prison workshop, hiding them in burger meat, and delivering them to these two criminals. Now, I don't want to make Joyce Mitchell kind of sound like the innocent victim in this story, because it did come out that there was a plan that David and Richard would kill Joyce's husband. But yeah, don't think of her as some victim. She was complicit in this. But just imagine the sheer riz of these two men. Like, Mitchell has a husband, a job, and somehow she was able to be manipulated and convinced by two criminals that the best course of action of her was to aid these criminals in their escape, and once these criminals escape, they can kill her husband and then all go to Mexico together. Like, that is crazy level manipulation. Once Richard and David had Mitchell on their side, their plan was in full effect. And from that point, it only took 6 months for that plan to be executed. Over these 6 months, Mitchell would slowly bring different tools and components into the jail cells of each of these men, and possibly do other things as well. Regardless, once these men had the tools, they were able to begin chipping away at their very own cell walls. Similar to the Alcatraz escapes, both of these men developed holes in their cells under the sink where they could slip into the endless labyrinth of tunnels existing within the prison. The men were quickly able to access the tunnel system behind the walls. However, it took most of that 6 months to develop a plan on exactly where to go in the tunnel system, and also to cut holes into huge steam pipes that they would eventually climb through for their escape. There's actually an investigation video showing two investigators going from the prison cell to the manhole cover, showing exactly how long and tight and uncomfortable this entire journey is. And it took the investigators only 20 minutes to get through all of it. This includes going down 6 stories via catwalks and pipes, and then traveling across the pipeline, going through small holes in the wall between blocks until they eventually get to a huge steam pipe that they likely took months to cut a hole into. And how they would do this is literally every night, making this entire journey to make slight holes in the pipe until they could finally cut the whole chunk of metal out of the pipe. And then eventually, once they could go into this pipe, they were able to climb through it, enter the final room that led them to essentially a sewer under the road, roughly 150 meters outside of the prison, where they could climb a ladder, raise the manhole cover, and be free. But the story doesn't end there, because even though Mitchell, up until this point, only brought the men tools, she also was supposed to be the getaway driver. But on the night of the escape, Mitchell had a panic attack, thought she was having a heart attack, and went to the hospital. So a different prison employee actually ended up being their getaway driver. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. On June 5th, 2015, at 10:30 p.m., both Matt and David were accounted for in the nightly head count at the prison. However, the next morning on June 5th at 5:50 a.m., during morning count, they were unaccounted for, and the search began. It only took a few hours for the prison to notice the external breach. They had only 150 meters outside of the prison wall. It was the obviously open manhole cover that had led directly to the basement of the prison. Due to this discovery, it didn't take long for investigators to find out exactly how Richard and David escaped. Interestingly, when the investigators were looking through the tunnel system that they used to escape, they found an interesting note. It was simply a piece of paper that said, "Have a nice day," and drawn below that was a racist Asian smiley face with a triangular rice hat, which is just odd. But now the men were free, but their plans were still not completed. The original plan was to murder Mitchell's husband and then flee to Mexico. But with Mitchell in the hospital and them having a completely different getaway driver, they decided their best bet was to go to Canada. But they couldn't just go straight there, and they had to take their time. And during that time, roughly 3 weeks, there was an extensive manhunt that was established by both the American and Canadian governments to make sure that these two men did not escape. 20 days after the initial escape, one of the two men was spotted for the first time. Richard Matt was spotted in Franklin County, New York. He was spotted because he was shooting at traffic with a 20-gauge shotgun taken from a hunting camp. Obviously, when you shoot at pedestrians, the police are going to get involved. And shortly after, Matt Matt was shooting at civilians, the police shot and killed Richard. But that's only Richard. At the time of Richard's death, David's location was still unknown, and the investigation was still well underway. And I can only assume for law enforcement that finding David was a lot more personal, as David was somebody who did kill a police officer. However, only 2 days after Richard was shot by police officers, David was spotted just jogging on the side of the road. The police officer that spotted him went to question him, where David began to run through a field and into a wooded area. The police officer quickly drew his pistol and shot David. However, David did not die. Interestingly, both of these two men were found only 2 kilometers from the Canadian-US border, meaning that if they weren't found when they did, they would have likely made it into Canada and possibly escaped conviction or death altogether. Or at the very least, they would have extended their freedom by quite a bit. After everything was said and done, Richard Matt was killed. Sweat pled guilty to an additional 2 counts of felony, first-degree escape, and an additional count of promoting prison contraband, which gave him an additional 7 years, which was served consecutively with his previous life sentence. Joyce Mitchell pled guilty and received 7 years in prison and a $6,300 fine, as well as $80,000 in restitution. And as of February 2020, she was actually released and is now on parole. And Gene Palmer, the backup driver and the other prison official who aided in the escape of these 2 killers, was sentenced to 6 months in jail and fined $5,300. So yeah, if you haven't learned anything in this video so far, I think one important takeaway is that if you ever do plan on escaping prison, 2 good ways of going about it are having a helicopter or just extreme riz. And at this point, I can't even imagine the possibilities of a man with extreme riz and a helicopter. Jokes aside, let's just move on to the next and final entry on this list. And I say this list because if you guys like this concept, feel free to leave a like or a comment below letting me know you like prison escape videos. I'd be more than happy to make more of them in the future. Your support always means a lot. Let's move on. Alfred George Hines was born in 1917, and at the young age of only 7 years old, his father died when he was caught for an armed robbery and was served corporal punishment that actually ended up killing him. He was sentenced to 10 lashes from the Cat 06, which is just a crazy whip, and this entire process killed him. And because of this, Hines decided to run away from home at the age of 7. Hines briefly stayed at an orphanage before he escaped and began living on his own and surviving off of petty theft, which later landed him in a juvenile detention center, which he, at that point, once again escaped from. Hines' upbringing was troubled to say the least, and when he turned 21, he was drafted into the Second World War. Something he didn't actually do, because he deserted the armed forces and went back to his full-time career of crime, which resulted in a jewelry heist that happened in 1953. This heist, performed by Hines, was in the multiple 6-figure range, and 90,000 of that was never found, ever. But shortly after this jewel heist, Hines was caught and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But like everybody else we've discussed on this list so far, Hines had no plans of staying in jail for his entire sentence. Only a few weeks into his stay in prison, Hines realized that at night, the guards were severely outnumbered, and there was really only 2 night guards per 1,000 inmates, which meant that Hines had a lot of time to work on his craft, and his craft in this case was metalworking. And what he was able to do was fashion a scrap piece of metal into a makeshift key to release himself from his cell without ever being detected. But picking the lock in his cell wasn't the only challenge he faced on this escape, because after he was out of his cell and out of the prison itself, he still had to climb a 20-foot wall. A feat so impressive that the media instantly gave him the name Houdini Hines because of his escape. Just keep in mind, for the guards, they were doing their nightly routine when they were walking by and they saw Hines, and then maybe an hour or 2 hours later when they would walk by again, Hines' cell was empty, there was no signs of any damage, and there was absolutely nothing changed besides the fact that Hines wasn't there. If they didn't know any better, Hines could have just disappeared into thin air. Although, that obviously wasn't the case. And after his escape, Hines spent 248 days as a free man working odd jobs until he was arrested again in 1956. And it was at this point when he was sent back to prison. But Hines knew that because he was going back to prison, he was going to be made an example of, because his initial escape made national headlines. And this obviously embarrassed the prison system and the government. So now that they had him back in their claws, they weren't going to let him go. And because of this, Hines had to think fast. And what Hines decided to do was, as he was being sent to prison for the second time, he decided to sue the prison system for misconduct. And even as a criminal, he had the right to a trial. And it was at this trial where he was able to execute his second escape. While in the courtroom, he asked the judge if he could use the washroom for just a moment. The judge agreed, and 2 guards brought Hines directly to the washroom, where they unshackled his hands and feet and allowed him to use the facility. But as soon as Hines was unshackled, he pushed both of the guards into the bathroom bathroom and locked it with a padlock that was left in the hallway by a co-conspirator, and the only reason he was able to even lock this door at all was because the day before the trial, a co-conspirator of Hines installed screw eyes on the stall door so that he could actually apply the padlock and lock these two in the washroom. After Hines' hands and feet were free and the guards were locked in the bathroom, he instantly made a run for it, and for the next 5 hours escaped directly to the airport where he was waiting for the next flight out of England. But before he could catch any flight, he was caught and brought back to prison for a third time. Within a year of being brought back to prison for the third time, he made his third and final escape. The escape itself was nothing to write home about, although it did go to show the sheer perseverance and dedication that Hines had to not being in prison. But after being caught for a final time and brought back to jail, he decided that escaping wasn't the way to go. And from that point on, he decided to consistently get into legal disputes with the prison system to try to prove his innocence or to get his jail time appealed. He was basically spending all of his time in jail using the legal system against itself to try to get out of jail ASAP. And while he wasn't successful at it, and he did serve the rest of his time in prison, he was able to win a few £1,000s from random settlements that he was pursuing. Hines also falls into the category of orphan slash foster care child turned prison escapee, which is interesting. That's definitely not something I intended to do in this video, but it is an interesting consistency I've noticed throughout most of these prison escapes. And I think the fact that Hines was able to escape prison 3 times definitely earned him the nickname Houdini Hines. But once again, we find ourselves in a situation where Hines would have been better off just serving the initial 12 years than escaping and then serving the rest of his time. Sure, he had more breaks in between, but living as an active fugitive is definitely not a life that I would want to live. I couldn't imagine having to look over your shoulder every day just to try to live a normal life. But I know I said that this was the last story in the video, but I actually have a quick bonus one, so let's get into it. Yoga is really relaxing and has a lot of health benefits. But one of the benefits that most people don't talk about when they speak of yoga is escaping prison. But for Korean thief Choi Gap-bok, being an expert in yoga for over 23 years was the deciding factor between being in jail and being a free man. Let me explain. On September 12th, 2012, Choi Gap-bok was arrested in association with a mysterious theft. It was assumed that he was the leader of a theft ring, and for that reason, the police wanted to hold him until they could gather more evidence on him in the entire situation. And on that day, Choi was placed in a cell. And while his stay was at that point undetermined, Choi was personally determined to make that stay as short as possible. And how he did so was extremely interesting, because during Choi's time in this jail cell, he realized that at the bottom of the jail cell door, there was a hole. And this hole was useful for him because every day this is how the guards would feed him. But he quickly began to ponder if this was a hole he could fit through. The hole was only 15 centimeters tall and 45 centimeters wide. Not large at all, but Choi wasn't really a large man either. Choi was only 5'4" and weighed roughly 120 pounds. Even still, this hole was put in these doors for food, not people. One night, after being fed dinner, Choi asked one of the guards if he could have some skin ointment. He felt a rash coming on and he wanted to subdue it early. And luckily, the guards obliged. They handed him a skin ointment and then went back to their post. And late into that night, Choi waited until the 3 guards that were monitoring his cell fell asleep, which is when Choi began to execute his master plan. Choi applied this skin ointment all across his body to essentially lube up and slide through the crack on the bottom of the door. After applying the ointment to his skin, specifically his upper body and head, he was able to escape his cell in only 34 seconds. And after escaping his cell, he was easily able to sneak out of the jail and be a free man. Hours after Choi had snuck out of the jail and was running as far away as he could from the jail itself, the officers woke up and they looked in his cell, and when they tried to wake up Choi, they realized that Choi was in his bed. There was a decoy in the place he should have been, but there was no evidence of an escape until they checked the CCTV footage and realized exactly how he escaped. Interestingly, Choi, who was in a cell for 5 days, had the wherewithal to put a decoy in his bed when the previous 2 criminals we just talked about were planning for 6 months and still couldn't drum up a decoy in any of that time. Just an interesting observation. But what else is interesting is that even though Choi was able to make nearly an impossible escape and use his flexibility and lubrication skills to escape a jail cell, he was not able to remain free for long, because 6 days after his escape, he was recaptured and put into a cell with a much smaller food slot. This one was a lot shorter, but I kind of wanted to add it as a bonus because I just thought it was funny. Some lube and yoga can get you out of a lot of tough situations. But if you guys enjoyed this video about the craziest prison escapes from around the world, check out the video on screen. It's a video I made a few months ago about the craziest prison escapes ever. But in case you already watched that video, just check out the channel. We've got so much good content for you to binge. Thanks again, Fume, for sponsoring this video. Check them out with my link in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, trust me, bro. Useless ancient instincts we all still have. As much as we like to believe that as a species we are civilized and technologically advanced, in reality, a lot of modern day society and our day-to-day life is still heavily influenced and, quite honestly, controlled by primal instincts, deeply ingrained in our brains over hundreds of thousands of years of human development. But in this video, we're going to discuss examples of primal instincts that were helpful at the time that today are quite useless, or in some cases, making our lives harder. Let's get started. I would guarantee that most people watching this video, if not everybody watching this video, enjoys a sweet treat. And while some of us enjoy a sweet treat guilt-free, some of us also feel bad that we quite often crave such sugary things that we know aren't good for us. But the reason most of us crave such sugary and sweet foods and drinks was at one point in time crucial for our survival. During the ancient prehistoric days of humanity, food was a luxury and likely the most valuable currency. And it's for that reason that humans were really eating anything and everything they could get their hands on. But not all foods are built the same. Eating bugs and leaves is cool, but nothing quite hits the spot to a caveman like something extremely sweet or something extremely fatty. And the reason for this is simple. Sugar specifically is extremely valuable to the body because it gives your body a quick boost of energy, something that many foods aren't able to provide. And because of this, your body responded extremely positive to this food source that was able to give you such a quick hit of energy. Even if your body wasn't in dire need of energy at the time, your body is able to store that excess energy in the form of fat, meaning that at any time, at any place, if there was anything sweet around, your body knew to consume it there and then. And at the time, this could have meant life or death. Now, unfortunately, the stakes today are not nearly as high. And I would say that most people, if not everybody watching this video, does not struggle with food scarcity either at all or definitely not to the extent that cavemen did. Meaning that eating the bag of gummy bears on your nightstand isn't life or death. It's really just how much willpower do you have to overcome your primal urges. In today's world, eating anything sweet you can get your hands on almost has the opposite effect, because at best, this excess sugar is just going to put extra weight on your body. And at worst, it's actually going to have a detrimental effect on your overall health. The complete opposite of the intent of this instinct in primal times. So if you ever feel bad about having low discipline when it comes to sweets, it's because a caveman hundreds of thousands of years ago realized that berries and honey give you a kick of energy that bugs, leaves, and animal fats just couldn't do. Oh, and as a quick bonus, the reason why everything in the world today is so sugary is directly related to the human instinct of craving excess sugar. Humans don't crave sugar because everything in the modern diet is full of sugar, because these companies realized long ago that humans fundamentally crave sugar. And if these food companies can provide it to you, you're very unlikely to say no. And that's another trend you'll notice in this video. Not only are your instincts personally working against yourself, but other entities are using your instincts against you for profit, which is kind of dystopian. Another more dystopian part of modern day life is the fact that even though we are living in the best time ever to exist as a human, we likely deal with the most issues ever. And this is because humans have a deeply ingrained negative bias, which, like you guessed, in primal times served a crucial purpose in our survival. But in the modern day, in a world full of complexity, it only makes our life that was supposed to be easier much harder. I would argue that most people understand that they should be grateful for everything they have in their life. But realistically, gratitude is something you kind of have to remind yourself to have and do. And this is because your mind isn't naturally programmed to be like, oh, this is so great, this is awesome. No, your mind is actually programmed for the opposite. The ancient primal world was filled with real immediate dangers, natural disasters, predators, other tribes, famine, and so forth. You and your loved ones' lives were consistently under attack. And because of this, the best way to survive in a world where everything could and would kill you is to be aware of those things and to primarily focus on the negative or dangerous aspects of life, which at the time was a lot more common than anything else. And while this bias as a caveman was extremely crucial, in the modern day where almost none of these threats exist, we are still dealing with the consequences of this bias. Just think about it. If there was two cavemen in prehistoric times, one who went on a walk and saw, oh, there's a dangerous thing, I'm not going to go there. Oh, I stepped on something sharp, this place could be dangerous. I'm going to go home and remember this and just, keep this in the back of my mind. Versus a caveman that went on a walk and was just like, oh, that's a pretty tree. Oh, cool. That's a cool looking lion running directly towards me. That's majestic. Which of the two do you think is going to survive? And I mean, the answer is kind of obvious. But like I mentioned, tiger attacks and starvation are fortunately not much of a risk for many people today. So we transition this worry and this part of our brain onto other aspects of more modern life. Job security, social status, rejection, failure, the opinions of others. And because the world that we live in is just so complex and there is so much to think about, and because the negativity bias is an instinct so deeply ingrained within our psyche, if you don't consciously try to counteract this negativity bias, it could lead to some very serious consequences. And it's extremely easy to spiral into overthinking and stressing and, coming up with worst case scenarios and ultimately developing things such as anxiety or depression. And a common example of this negativity bias is, once we lay down on our bed and close our eyes, all of a sudden every horrible thing that happened to us ever comes to mind. Keep in mind, in ancient times, before you go to bed, it's helpful to have a checklist of everything you notice today that could be bad, but in modern times, it's just gonna make going to bed harder and possibly damage your self-esteem. And if that was the first time you've ever done something like that, then you probably experienced a lot of fear, specifically fear of the unknown, which is likely one of the oldest human instincts we all have to this very day. Our ancestors had to essentially trial and error every aspect of life always, and the stakes were typically life or death. And because of this, the best way to mitigate as much risk as possible was to simply stick with what you know and avoid what you didn't know, which led to the development of the fear of the unknown. During ancient times, exploring a place that was dark and you couldn't quite see, encountering an animal that you were unfamiliar with, or even seeing weather that you haven't quite seen before, all could very well lead to the death of you and anybody around you. Meaning that the best way to stay alive was to avoid and fear any of these things you were unfamiliar with. And this instinct is still around to this very day. But once again, in modern times, this instinct isn't helpful and is often counterproductive. And while I would definitely say that there is an argument for the fear of the unknown being helpful today, there is still places where it isn't helpful. Specifically when it comes to exploring opportunities that could ultimately be beneficial. Like, let's say, starting a new relationship, trying a new food, going to a new city, moving, meeting new people. In the modern day, when things are so safe and so civilized, there are so many amazing opportunities to come out of exploring the unknown and seeking discomfort and truly trying to overcome this instinct. But the reality is just that. This is an instinct that has to be overcome to experience these things. And because of this, there is a saying that I think is rather accurate, is that most people would rather experience a familiar hell than an unknown heaven. And it's interesting because even though in that hypothetical that the unknown situation would be objectively better, because it's unknown, it's still scarier than dealing with something objectively worse that you're at least familiar with. But it wasn't only the unknown that our ancestors were afraid of. There was actually quite a few fears that our ancestors hold that we still hold today. Another example being the fear of failure. Now, once again, there is instances where this fear is still helpful in the modern day, but as a whole, the exaggerated fear of failure is more detrimental to people than it is helpful. In ancient times, goals were simple and immediate. If you were on a hunt, your goal was to secure an animal. If you're looking to reproduce, your goal is to secure a mate. If you're looking for shelter, your goal is to find a warm and comfortable place. And in all of these instances, if you failed to meet your goal, your life or your bloodline was done. And those stakes are pretty high. And over hundreds of thousands of years of development, our brain began to realize that if we really want something, we cannot accept failure as an option. And while in the modern day, many of our goals are not life or death at all, a lot of people still act like them. Doing worse on an assignment than you anticipated, not getting the promotion you wanted, having an application denied for almost anything. All of these things are uncomfortable and upsetting, but in most cases, they are not life or death. Although some people still act like they are, but it is so ingrained in our being to have that exaggerated fear of failing that typically only holds us back and will cause us to feel a sense of dread when in reality the situation may be mildly infuriating or potentially disappointing, but definitely not life or death. But another consequence of failure in ancient times beyond just immediate death was also a loss of social status. You see, humans have always been tribal people, pack animals if you will. And within packs or groups, there is a hierarchy. And within hierarchies, there is status, which determines where you stand on the food chain. In ancient times, we were extremely motivated to seek status, not to satisfy our egos, but to ensure our survival. Because in ancient tribes, the higher status individuals typically got the most benefits, the best shelter, the most food, and so on. And the opposite was also true. If you were low status in the tribe, you would be getting scraps. You would be living in the worst of places. And in severe situations, you would be outright outcast from the group, essentially being left for dead. And for that reason, it's reasonable to understand why seeking social status was so important in prehistoric times. But as we all know, this is not a habit that's gone away. And in modern times, people seek status more than ever, while, interestingly, the stakes are much lower. Sure, in the modern day, there is so many benefits to having status. Celebrities, for example, have access to the best of everything. They get treated better than everybody else. They can afford everything and still get things for free. And there are definitely benefits to that in the modern day. Although I would argue it doesn't guarantee your survival anymore. Because in the modern day, you don't need social status to live. An entry-level job, a simple side hustle, or even a small business are all things that could sustain you and provide you a comfortable and potentially even abundant life, with status being completely out of the equation. And sure, this drive for status could still give you a better life, but it also could send you on a completely meaningless pursuit that at the end of your life you realize wasn't worth it at all. And I would say in most cases, this drive is almost solely egoic and not survival focused. And I think one of the most common instances that we all experience in regards to this drive for status is how we compare ourselves to others consistently. In a world full of social media, we are force-fed other people's lives on a daily basis. And typically that experience looks like, wow, they're doing better than me. And the reason we do this is because we are perceiving them to be higher status than us. And it means that we are at risk of being evicted from the group and getting less than we may need to survive. And as we know, this mindset of comparison and seeing ourselves as less than others who only present the best parts of their life typically leads to anxiety, depression, and many of the other common consequences of having a primal brain in an extremely advanced world. Which is why I believe this drive to be completely useless, if not counterproductive. Because in most cases, you just feel worse about yourself, even though you are completely capable of surviving and having a meaningful and happy life. But even if you don't crave being a high status individual, you typically at the very least crave fitting in. Which brings us to the next ancient instinct, the human impulse of adopting a herd mentality. As we just mentioned in the previous instinct, humans in tribes were safer, and humans on their own were not. And while climbing the social ladder is one goal, even maintaining where you are is an entirely separate goal. The human brain evolved in tribes and closely monitored the group, copying all of their behavior because they see that these other people are alive, so they're gonna do what these other living, surviving people are doing, because that's really the ultimate goal. And because of that, most people were on the same page. While at the same time, individuals who showed attributes that weren't directly in line with the tribe, whether it be doing something that resulted in their instant death or simply doing something that the tribe didn't approve of, let's say not reciprocating sharing food or not contributing, would result in being exiled, which was essentially a death sentence. If you notice that everybody does one thing and the people who don't do that thing either die or get kicked out of the group, you're going to quickly learn that it's best to do what everybody else is doing and not stray too far from that. In prehistoric times, it meant coexistence. But once again, today, the stakes are not nearly as high. But that doesn't stop our brain from trying to keep us in line with the greater group. Everybody in one shape or another fears rejection. Whether it be talking to somebody you find attractive, trying to sell something, or simply trying to find a place that you belong. Nobody wants to be told no or that they don't fit in. And this is something that we experience from a very young age and most people carry through the rest of their life. And while herd mentality can manifest itself in a lot of ways, it's most commonly experienced by simply not wanting to stand out or make too many waves or rock the boat. So if you ever feel bad about your desire to fit in and want to be somebody else or want to have other attributes so you could be more like others, it's not that you hate yourself or it's not that you're wrong. It's simply the biology of your brain telling you that if you are more like others, you will have a higher chance of living. And while that's not really the case today, your brain doesn't really know the difference. And similar to our fear of the unknown, this herd mentality in most cases in the modern time holds us back rather than protects us. We stop ourselves from pursuing the things we truly love or doing things we really want to do. It stops us from taking risks or doing things that seem out of the norm. The goal of this herd mentality is to keep us alive, not happy. And what that looks like today is simply doing something that you know is safe even if you don't like to do it, because doing the thing you want to do might not give you that same safe result. And that could apply to a career, a lifestyle, or really anything. Your brain has decided that the safest way to live is going with the path of least resistance. And what that typically looks like is doing what everybody else is doing. And this is an ancient instinct that is very evident in the modern day. Almost as evident, at least, as our need for control. I would say a good majority of people at some point in their life struggle with having a pretty strong to severe need for control in at least some aspect aspect of their life, whether it be some sort of power trip or perfectionism or simply a sheer need for things to go their way. The ancient human mind craved control because it was predictable, and it craved that simplicity and predictability, and how that manifested was learning to seek order and trying to create a routine in a world that was completely unpredictable, but somehow simultaneously seasonal and cyclical. And how this looked in ancient times was using this need for this control to establish routines that allowed life to exist, following migration patterns of animals that would sustain your tribe's life, understanding the seasons and following weather patterns and predicting what happens when you saw a certain cloud, controlling the amount of wood you put on your fire to ensure it never went out. All of these actions are rooted in a desire for routine, order, and ultimately control. But in the modern day, this need for control has manifested rather differently. And the biggest way that our need for control hinders us in the modern day is by people trying to control factors that are out of their control. And this need that people feel that ultimately leads them to have extreme stress and anxiety about certain situations. In ancient times, the only thing we could control was our actions. And our need for control was based in our actionable pursuit of living. But in the modern day, with infinite information at our fingertips in a world that is more complex than our brain could ever perceive, this need for control oversteps its usefulness and becomes a hindrance, whether it be just being socially unlikable because you are too bossy, or being unable to enjoy something because it is not to your exact liking, or spending your free time worrying about something that you have no control over simply because you desire it going a certain way. And these negative feelings associated with feeling out of control leads to a negative spiral, because if you feel out of control, you feel weak, you feel less. And it's through these negative emotions that our brain develops pattern recognition, so it knows exactly what to avoid, so it cannot feel bad, so it cannot die. And this brings us to the final instinct on this list. Looking for patterns that are basically not there. This instinct comes from our brain's natural desire to want to make sense of this world we live in. And in prehistoric times, spotting a pattern could make the difference between your existence and your very quick non-existence. If you notice that every time you eat a certain red berry, you throw it violently, you'll probably begin to avoid that. If you notice a pattern of everybody who wrestles with a tiger turning into red jelly, you're not going to wrestle with tigers. And from these examples, we can see the obvious advantage of pattern recognition. It's our brain's quick and easy way to quickly evaluate a situation and whether it should be avoided or pursued. And pattern recognition works both ways. Similar to our sugar craving we mentioned at the beginning of the video, if we see something that we know is sweet, we are going to be motivated to get to it. And on the same token, we may be hesitant to get this honey because we know that while the honey is sweet, the bees are plentiful and they are stinging. In the modern day, pattern recognition is definitely not life or death, but it is an extremely important part of our everyday lives. And this ability to recognize patterns allows us to maintain a lot of free mental bandwidth, because if every time we approached a certain situation we had to re-evaluate it from scratch, well, you would be thinking consistently. But if you have a kind of mental catalog of things you could quickly reference every time you see something you've seen before, your mind is able to streamline the process of thinking, which is something your brain's always trying to do. But here's the thing, even though pattern recognition in the modern day can and is extremely helpful in some cases, much like the others we've discussed that are helpful, they typically overstay their welcome and overstep and can be very detrimental. And how pattern recognition typically oversteps in the modern day is by causing us to misinterpret events without context, overthink situations that are not as deep as we think, or jump to conclusions that are not there. And the reason why we do all of these things is because our mind is consistently trying to understand things. So if we have a little bit of context around something, our brain is going to try as hard as possible to try to categorize the unknown with something we know, which is most often seen when people are generalizing things, whether it be about ideas or even people. Our brain wants to seek a pattern so it can reassure itself it knows what's going on here. In ancient times, if you saw an animal with pointy teeth, you didn't need any more context about it. But in modern times, you can see a person with tattoos and go, wow, this is a bad, scary person, I'm going to avoid them. When in reality, the fact that somebody may or may not have tattoos means absolutely nothing about their character and who this person may be. But our ancient brain that we possess wants to keep us safe and wants to generalize as much as possible, to quickly process information and to conserve as much energy as possible. And that wasn't a knock at people with tattoos. I have tattoos myself, they're just under my red shirt. But it's an old-timey stereotype that I thought would make sense. And by this point of the video, you've probably already begun to recognize some patterns yourself. One pattern is that all of the entries on this list are actually intertwined and typically work off of each other to help your brain do its best to understand things quickly and survive. But another pattern I want to suggest is that our brain is just doing the best it can. It's obvious that our brain has evolved to be as beneficial as possible, and our brain has done an extremely good job of developing an operating system that is optimized to keep us alive in the prehistoric world. However, while we have had a brain that has had hundreds and thousands of years to develop to a certain style of life, over the last few thousand years, our civilization has developed rapidly at a pace that our brain is simply not able to catch up to, which has landed us in the situation that we are in now. We are living in an extremely advanced society using powerful hardware that have a outdated operating system, and we're just trying to make it all work. But the bright side is this. While our brain still has instincts within it that are no longer helpful and sometimes hurtful to us, we still have the power and ability to overcome these ancient instincts. With awareness, focus, and intention, you can consciously make an effort to begin to personally reprogram your brain to be more suited to live in the modern day. And these are things that we've already began to do, whether it be consciously or unconsciously. And at the end of the day, our brain is our friend, and our instincts are trying their best to keep us alive. The world we live in is just a little bit different than what our brain is used to. So we've got to kind of update the software on our own, but that's kind of just part of the journey. So if you've been struggling with any of these things that I've talked about in this video, whether it be a craving for sugar, trying to fit in, feeling bad about other people being higher status than you, or craving control, realize that you're not broken and you're not wrong. You're simply experiencing the ancient programming that your brain has developed over hundreds of thousands of years of existence. But understand that this doesn't define you, and that you can have a conscious impact on how your brain operates moving forward with enough intention and effort. So yeah, you came to this video for some interesting facts, and now you're leaving with the motivational speech. If you enjoyed this video, check out the video on screen right now. It's a video about the worst times in human history to ever be born. And in that video, I discussed some times when some of these instincts would have very much so come in handy. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. And as always, trust me, bro.